Thank you for joining us here today. I'm pleased to welcome all of you, friends, colleagues, former students of Gary Becker's. It's gratifying to see such a large and diverse audience for this organization. As I understand it, we have guests from over 120 organizations and institutions from around the world, which is an extraordinary tribute and tremendous reflection on Gary's breadth of influence on all of us. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Gidi Becker and the entire Becker family who will be joining us here today. Your presence makes this occasion all the more special. We're honored that you could join us. We too miss Gary very much. Thank you for being here. My sincere thanks to my colleagues Kevin Murphy, Eddie Lazear, and Jim Heckman for organizing this great conference, and to all the presenters who have represented a broad range of research in areas that Gary so steadfastly pursued, inspired, and expanded. The BFI staff has been working incredibly hard over the last several weeks to pull this thing together with their great efforts. I think this will be a big success, and any issues that you have, please contact them. They do all the hard work. I'd also like to acknowledge the CME Foundation for their generous support of this conference and other Becker Friedman Institute initiatives. So this audience is particularly special to this. Is particularly special to the Institute, since many of you were here 3 years ago to celebrate Gary's 80th birthday. Today, tomorrow, we're here to recognize the intellectual legacy to economics and more broadly to social sciences. I'd like to say a few words about Gary and reflect on his contributions to economics and his impact on the world. As we know, Gary was a tremendous scholar. He was at the University of Chicago campus for about 5 decades as a beloved teacher, as a supportive and inspiring faculty member, and as a wonderful colleague. Each of us is aware of Gary's extraordinary contributions, and we all have our own individual special memories of him. For me, Gary personified Chicago economics and his intense commitment to economic analysis and its value in enhancing our understanding of the world. He had a remarkably broad vision of the field, as will be evident in this conference. Gary had an insatiable appetite to address seemingly complex questions pertaining to social outcomes and transform them into ones amenable to economic thinking. I was lucky enough to have office next to Gary's for several years and enjoyed and learned from interactions about a variety of topics related to economics. I found Gary's quizzing me and providing me penetrating comments even on research that seemed removed from Gary's interests initially surprising, but in reality there's very little that's truly far from his interests. Gary's a mainstay as an intellectual legacy of economics at Chicago, together with scholars like Frank Knight, Jacob Viner, and Milton Friedman, who came before him. But he will stand for his own unique and distinctive path-breaking contributions. The talks we will hear during this conference will reflect his eclectic and creative perspectives and will remind us of his extraordinary legacy. Now, to begin the conference, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Eddie Lazear from Stanford, a longtime colleague and a friend of Gary's. The session's scheduled for 45 minutes. Eddie will reserve a little bit of time towards the end of it to address a few questions which you might have. Eddie will be talking about demographics, entrepreneurship, Becker's human capital, and fertility economics applied. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. Good morning. I have the honor of giving the first paper in celebration of Gary's life, and what an amazing life it was. Gary opened up so many fields of economics that it's almost impossible to write a paper broadly related to labor economics that does not find its roots in Gary's work. That's the case with the paper that we're going to talk about today, which combines 2 of his pioneering research efforts, both in human capital and in demography. Gary was the person most responsible for advancing the theory of human capital, and he connected fertility and demographics to economics, introducing the notion of rational economic choice into what had previously been a more mechanical Malthusian notion of demographic growth. We, and when I say we, my co-author, one of whom is here, James Leong, and Jackie Wang, who isn't here, argue that demographic structure has important implications for the acquisition of human capital on the job and on determining who gets to do what in the firm. The basic motivation for this work comes from noticing that when you look across countries, you see that they vary very dramatically in terms of their average rates of entrepreneurship. So some countries have very high rates of entrepreneurship, some countries have very low rates of entrepreneurship. And the other thing that is quite noticeable is that those patterns tend to be linked to the structure of the population. In particular, younger countries seem to have high rates of entrepreneurship, and older countries seem to have low rates of entrepreneurship. And the question is why? Now, there's another motivating fact that I'd like to just point out, and this is actually an observation that James made a couple of years back, and that is if you look within a country, so for example, suppose you take a country like Japan, and you look at that over time and you say, all right, well, Japan right now has very low rates of entrepreneurship, but there were times in the past when Japan was an entrepreneurial powerhouse. If you think back to the 70s and 80s, that was the case. Now, what is also true is that if you look at Japan, the demographic structure has shifted over time. Japan is an aging country. It's become a much older population. So the question is there a link between the demographic structure of the population and the rate of entrepreneurship? And then the issue that we want to address is how can we think about that link? So the story that we're going to tell, in some ways, actually is a reflection of James's personal life, and I'll let him tell you about that during the breaks. But the idea is the following, that there are two components that are necessary to having the human capital and the ability to start a business. And one is you have to have the energy and creativity of youth, which, by the way, Gary maintained into his last years. But you have to have the creativity of youth, but you also have to have some know-how. Just being creative and energetic is not enough to start a business. What you have to do is you have to acquire the human capital that is important in understanding how to make a business grow. And the easiest way to acquire that human capital is to do so through the process of on-the-job training. Again, an important aspect of human capital acquisition that Gary emphasized, both when he talked about specific and general human capital. We're talking primarily about general human capital here. So the notion is that when you're on the job and when you have experiences on the job, those experiences help to create the human capital that will then be important in starting a business. But the link is the following. The link with demographics is the following. Your ability to acquire that human capital on the job depends on the actual task assignments that you have. And so if you take a place, just to give you an example, and again, I'm thinking of James's background in Silicon Valley. If you take a place like Silicon Valley back in the 90s, the whole valley was a very young environment. Everybody in that community was young. They were the only ones who had the skills appropriate for starting those businesses. And so even very junior people in companies like Oracle, where James worked, would be given high-level responsibility, and they would have the opportunity of doing things that would teach them how to start their own businesses later on. And so the idea that we're going to push is that it's not only the fact that young people have the energy and creativity, but if those young people have the advantage of being in a firm where they are assigned high-level jobs that then create the human capital for them, they will then be able to go out later and start the business. Okay? So the main implication that differentiates this theory from other theories of entrepreneurship is that this theory says that within every age group, for any given age, the older is the country, the lower will be the rate of entrepreneurship. And that's the key thing, that's the key testable implication that distinguishes this theory from other theories. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes is present a theory. We'll actually, this is very much in Gary's style because it's quite a simple theory, basically just a two-equation structure, really. And then we will test it using data from something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is a new data set, relatively new data set that's been out. And we'll try to show you that the implications of the theory, and there are 7 very specific theoretical predictions that come out of the theory, are all verified when we look at the data. So very much in the spirit of the way Gary did his own work, he would derive theoretical implications from thinking about things in a intuitive but pretty simple way, and then go out and test them by looking at the real world. So that's what we're up to. All right. So again, the intuition here is the following. One needs creativity to start a business, but you also need skills. High-level experience is more valuable to acquiring those skills, and if you are in a young country rather than an old country, you're more likely to get those experiences because those positions are not going to be blocked by the older individuals or dominated by the older individuals. And that's the basic story. So that's pretty much it. In English, that's what you're going to see. We're going to formalize that, and then we're going to show you some numbers that hopefully will convince you that this actually has some validity. All right. So let me show you basically the results without giving you the formal stuff first. This pretty much tells you the whole story. So these data come from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And what we're looking at here is 3 groups of countries. We split the countries up into young, middle, and old countries based on the median age of those countries. And if you do that, you'll see that there are 3 things that hopefully jump out at you from this picture. The first is that the young countries have higher entrepreneurship rates at every given age. So at any age, the young countries have the highest entrepreneurship rates. And it's also true that the middle-aged countries have higher entrepreneurship rates than the old countries. Okay, so that's the first point. And that was what I said in the introduction. That's pretty much the main prediction of this theory that differentiates it from other theories. The second thing you'll note is that the pattern is an inverted U shape. So entrepreneurship is lowest for the very young, and it's also lowest for the very old, and it peaks in the middle. Here, if you look at the young one where it's most pronounced, you can see peaks somewhere around age 30. And again, that's the story that I was telling you at the beginning. You need 2 things in order to start a business. You need youth and energy, but you also have to know something. And it takes a while to learn those things, and that's why you don't see the youngest people being the entrepreneurs at higher rates than the middle-aged people. So that's the second implication, and that's the second thing that we're going to show you again in a little bit more formal, with a little bit more formal approach in a moment, but this is basically the story. Then the other thing you should notice is that the shape of those curves are somewhat different. And what I mean by somewhat different is that they are flatter for the old countries than they are for the young countries, or the inverted U shape is most pronounced for the young countries. And the reason for that is that, and this will come out of the theory, one of the implications of the theory, is that when countries age, the groups that are most affected by that aging will be the groups in the middle of the age distribution. And that's a proposition that we will show you. It comes pretty much right out of a particular demographic structure that we assume, test, and verify. Okay? So those are the three basic points. So if this were a Chicago seminar, I would have tried to spit that out really quickly because I know I'm not going to get another word in edgewise, particularly if Gary's in the room. But you pretty much know the whole story now from looking at this picture and from hearing what I just told you in English. All right. Again, in the tradition of Gary, we want this to be a really serious seminar, so we're going to treat this as if it is a seminar setting, and I'm going to actually put up a model, and I think all of us are going to do pretty much the same thing. So there are 2 parts to this model. First is the demographic structure, and the second is the economic aspect of it, and I want to divide those up. So the demographic structure that we assume is the following. What we're going to postulate is that the share of the population at any given age A depends on a single parameter, and that single parameter is R. R is called the shrinkage rate here. So it's the rate at which the population is shrinking. The higher the R, the higher the shrinkage rate, the older the population. The lower the R, the lower the shrinkage rate, the younger the population. If R is 0, that means the population has a constant pattern. If R is positive, there are more old guys than young guys. If R is negative, there are more young guys than old guys. That's it. Okay? And this is a particular functional form that we assume. And the implication that we get, particularly about the way that inverted U shifts with age, really comes out of this assumption. But what we're going to show you is that this assumption is actually a very good assumption and is backed up by the data. And so for right now, just humor me and assume that it's actually true. Okay? And then the cum is just the cumulative distribution is just shown below. Okay. So what are the properties of that structure? Well, there are basically two properties that inform the rest of the theory and provide the predictions that we need in order to go to the data. And the first one is the statement that the one that I gave you earlier, this is just a result of this particular functional form, which says that as a population ages, it affects the rank of the middle-aged workers by more than it does at either end of the distribution. And that's just, again, functional form that just comes directly from the assumption of this particular demographic structure. And then the second little piece here just says that the proportion of people below any age A is going to decrease in R. In other words, it decreases as the population ages. And again, that's pretty intuitive. I don't think there's anything particularly surprising about that. But that's what's assumed by this particular structure. OK, so here's a young country. Uganda is a young country, the youngest country in the population here, in the distribution. And Uganda has lots of young people relative to old people. This one is Japan. And Japan has more old people than it does young people. And then if R were equal to 0, there would be the same proportion of people at every given age group. So again, that just comes directly out of the functional form that we assume. All right, what's the model of entrepreneurship? Pretty simple model. 3 components. First is you need skills, human capital. Human capital is H. You also need creativity and energy. Creativity and energy is Q. And you also need a little bit of luck. Maybe you need a lot of luck. Okay? Some of you in here have been both skilled and energetic and have also had some pretty good luck associated with what you've done. So good for you. I've had some luck too, but not of that kind. So. All right, so all this says then is that you will start a business if V, the value of starting that business, is greater than greater than 1. In this case, what we mean by greater than 1 is we're normalizing that relative to the alternative value of your time. So you could go out and work for someone else, or you can start your own business. And that's pretty much it. Those are the basic ingredients of the model. And what that does is it implies a function that says we can write the average entrepreneurship rate in the country or the entrepreneurship rate as a function of age and the shrinkage parameter. And that will depend on human capital, creativity, and that depends on R as well. Or, if we want, we can write it as a function of SA, where SA is the share of the population that we have at that given age A, all right, or below that given age A. All right, so that's pretty much it. So let me just walk you through the theoretical results. And again, in the style of Gary, I'm going to tell you what we have here, say it in English, explain it to you, and not spend a whole lot of time bothering you with the technical details which are contained in this paper. I'm sort of a step ahead of few of my co-authors here. We actually have a real paper, and it is available on the NBER. Sorry.
That was a hint.
Yeah. So, but it is available if you want to look at it. Okay. So entrepreneurship at any given age A is decreasing in the population parameter. That's probably the most important result. As I said earlier, that's the thing that distinguishes this from other theories, because it's not just that young people are more creative, it's that 50-year-olds are going to have lower rates of entrepreneurship in an old country than they are in a young country, and that's what's different. Okay, so that's the first one. And then a corollary of that is that the entrepreneurship rate rises in the share of the population under that particular age group, SA. Similarly, for a given rank, SA, the entrepreneurship rate falls in A. That just simply means that young people are more creative. So if you hold the population dynamics constant, it is still true that young people, otherwise, other things equal, would have a higher rate of entrepreneurship. We call that the creativity effect. The other one we call the rank effect. It's kind of where you stand in the relative population. Okay. What are the other results? Well, this just says for the economy as a whole. Now, if we aggregate up across all age groups, the average rate of entrepreneurship for the whole economy will also depend on this population parameter R. That's not quite as obvious as it seems, because you have different weights. So if you have a population that's aging, you have to take into account the share that is at every age, so you have a composition effect as well as this within age group effect. But that's true. A corollary of that is simply that we can look at that not only with respect to this shrinkage parameter R, but an easier thing to think about is the median age of the population, and those things move perfectly together, one-to-one, and so we can look at the median age as well, and we will. And then third, the relation of entrepreneurship to age is inverted U. I already told you that. And then finally, and this is the one that's a little less obvious again, is that the entrepreneurship rates shift down more for the middle-aged workers than they do for the senior workers. Okay, so that's it. Those are the 7 theoretical propositions, the 7 theoretical results, and what I want to do is show you those results. So let me very briefly describe the data that we use. This is, again, called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It's a survey that was put together by a British organization. And they started collecting data back around 2000, and we have data up through 2010. Unfortunately, they did not do every country in every year. So they did a few countries. In particular, they did the United States, they did the United Kingdom, but they didn't do every country in every year. So when we look at things like fixed effects, country-specific fixed effects, and try to play on the panel aspect of it, we're really only using a few countries to do that. But still, that's useful, it's informative. 82 countries. There are a number of definitions of entrepreneurship that they use in this survey. One that we have here is, the one that we use the most, is that you manage and own a business that's up to 42 months old, so it's a new business. We want to make sure it's closely related to your age right now and not something you started years ago. And you got to pay wages. So this is not a cleaning person or a gardener. This is someone, it could be a cleaning person or a gardener, as long as they have that as their business and they hire other people. So that's the notion of entrepreneurship that we're using here. We have some additional definitions of entrepreneurship that we'll walk you through, and we tested for the robustness of this. It turns out that the results are not particularly sensitive, at least not qualitatively sensitive, to different definitions of entrepreneurship. And I'll just, if we have time, I'll run you through those at the end. Okay, there are additional data sets that we needed to use, population statistics. So we got that from the U.S. Bureau of Census International Database. They collect information on 200 countries, all the ages, and in fact, that's the data set that the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor actually uses to calculate their weights. So it's internally consistent. And then finally, we also wanted to look at some other characteristics that might affect entrepreneurship. The most obvious ones are GDP per capita, education levels, startup costs, business startup costs, and property rights. Those are the ones that people generally mention, so we collected data on those as well. Okay. That's pretty much it. So summary statistics, the only one that's really noticeable here for you is that the average rate of entrepreneurship is about 6% in our sample. We've got about 1.3 million observations across the 82 countries. Okay. So what are the results? Well, remember at the beginning I said there were two parts to the model. There's the demographic structure, and then there's the economic model of the incentives to become an entrepreneur. So this just tests the demographic structure, and it says how well does that particular functional form fit the data. And what we did here in order to find out how well it fit the data is we estimated an R, that is, we estimated a shrinkage parameter for each one of our 82 countries. We did that non-linearly. How do we do that? Well, we have the shares in each of our 45 age groups. And so we can take those shares and then simply fit that function that we have there and estimate the R for that. Then just simply plug it back in, get a predicted share, regress the actual share on the predicted share, and see how close they are. So just all we're doing is just goodness of fit kind of thing here. And if you do that, the R squared is 0.998. So pretty darn good, okay? Pretty close. So basically what that says is that this functional form fits the data very nicely. So the assumption that the functional form that I gave you at the very beginning is a good description, a one-parameter description of the population, seems to be a pretty good one. Okay? Now, let me show you some data that actually relates to the rates of entrepreneurship across countries. And what you see here is a scatter plot. This is all the countries. We did the same thing for the OECD countries alone. And you see basically the same thing, although it's not quite as clear as we see in these data. But what you tend to see, if your eye looks at this, is if you were connecting the dots, you'd see a negative line through there. And similarly, a negative line through there. And if you estimate it, if you actually just run the regression, you will see that it is a negative relationship, statistically significant. So there's a stronger tendency to have entrepreneurs among the young countries, either measured by the median age or by the shrinkage rate, than among the old countries. Okay, so again, just a picture of the thing that kind of motivated the whole story. So now let's look at some simple empirical results here that come from using the global entrepreneurship data and ask, how do these things line up with the theory? So what we're doing in this table is simply looking at the entrepreneurship rate for the country, average entrepreneurship rate for the country, and relating that to the, relating that to the population parameter R, the shrinkage parameter, and to the median age. That's pretty much what this is all about. And what you see, of course, is pretty much what you saw in that other picture, and that is that the entrepreneur, baby business, that stands for baby business, okay? So that means a young business, you're an entrepreneur, and young businesses are negatively related to the shrinkage rate. That is, older populations, countries with older populations have lower entrepreneurship rates on average. So that's the basic finding. That's what I showed you in the picture. This is just a table saying essentially the same thing. It's also true if we do this in terms of median age. The older the country, the higher the, the lower the entrepreneurship rate. Okay, what about other stuff? You know, the obvious thing that you think about is, do other factors matter? People have talked about entrepreneurship as being a function of the underlying institutional aspects of the country. Some countries are more conducive to entrepreneurship than other countries. And what are those? Well, again, the ones we looked at were per capita GDP, education, tertiary education, startup costs, and an index of property rights. And they, sort of matter sometimes on and off. But what you see is that the story about the shrinkage parameter still survives. Basically, that doesn't wipe it out. It's still there and pretty much, almost as strong. Okay? It's also true, by the way, even in the fixed effects. So as I mentioned earlier, the fixed effects regression, where we're looking within a country over time, it's only a 10-year period, so you're not going to get that much mileage from that. Unfortunately, it's only a few countries. You don't get that much. As you'd expect, the significance of the coefficients go down, standard errors go up, and so forth. But again, the same story seems to be there. So it seems to show up even in the fixed effect story. Okay, so what's the summary? Again, higher are or older countries, aging countries, have lower rates of entrepreneurship, either as measured by the shrinkage parameter or by the median age, and including controls might matter, might not matter, but it doesn't really affect our basic story. Okay, so this is a more interesting table. What this does is it says, now let's look within each age category, each age group, within the country. So every country now has 45 age groups. We're looking at people between 20 and 64 years old, 45 age groups. And within those age groups, what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, for a given age, if you vary the population parameter, you look at old countries, aging countries, and you're looking at 40-year-olds in aging countries, how do they compare with 40-year-olds in younger countries? And that's what this gets at in a rough way, because what it does is it holds age constant, and it takes into account then the shrinkage parameter. So this is for any given age, what do you get? And again, the story comes through. Those countries that are older tend to have lower entrepreneurship rates, and that's true, again, for all countries. It's true in the OECD sample. It's true whether you use R as your population measure or whether you use S, which is the share of people younger than you, as your population measure. You get basically the same kind of story. And also true, again, with the fixed effects. So Proposition 1, then, is the most important thing, I guess, that we get from it. That's what I started out saying. That's the thing that differentiates this theory from anything else, which is that within any given age category, it's true that the older countries are the ones that have the lower entrepreneurship rates. What's also true is that age enters negatively. That's corollaries 1 and 2, and the share enters positively. Again, so those are those two. And then Proposition 3 says that the relation of entrepreneurship to age is inverted U-shaped. Let me just show you that. I kind of skipped over that. That's here. This is just a reduced form, simple form. Just age squared comes in negative. The linear term comes in positive. So you get that inverted U-shape, okay? Which is what I showed you in the picture earlier, so you're not surprised by that. You already saw it. Okay, now we can do a bit better because we actually have 45 independent regressions that we can run. Why? Because every age group allows us to look across country for every single age group independently. Now, they don't necessarily have to be independent, but at least they could potentially be independent tests. And so what we did was we looked at those independently for each of our 45 age groups, and what we found is that in all of those 45 age groups, almost all, we get a statistically significant negative relationship of entrepreneurship to population age, okay, within every single age group across all the countries. So for all 45 of those. Again, that's just a stronger version of what I just showed you earlier. Okay, and then finally, and this is the last proposition, so I've got 6 out of 7 now. This is Proposition 4. This is the last one, and what this says is that the tendency for entrepreneurship rates to decline with aging happens more for the middle-aged guys than it does for the old guys or the young guys. You see that the coefficient here is biggest for the 30-year-olds and smallest at either end. So basically this just says, this is the coefficient of R, which is the shrinkage rate on the entrepreneurship. And it says if I do that within age group, what I find is the guys that are hit the hardest by an aging population are the middle-aged people, okay? And recall that comes from the demographic structure that we assume. That's essentially a result that comes directly out of that demographic structure. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now, what about alternatives? Well, there are a couple of alternatives that we can think about. One is, reverse causation, that it's not the population that causes entrepreneurship, it's entrepreneurship that causes the population. Now, that's kind of implausible if you're thinking about that in an organic way, that people knew that the entrepreneurship rate 30 years from now was going to be really high, so they decided to have a bunch of kids to do that. So that doesn't work. But it does work for immigration, okay? The immigration story at least goes the right way, and that makes some sense. If you have a entrepreneurial country, think about what's happening in Europe. Those of you who are from the UK, Richard and some of the others here, know that London is a boom town. It's a boom town attracting entrepreneurial people from all over the rest of Europe. So that's consistent with that. The problem is it's too small. It just, it can work in the right direction, but it's too small. If you kind of go through the numbers and calculate how big could that be, the answer is too small. I'd say the most compelling alternative is that countries that are old, like Japan, are just not good places to start businesses. They're not good places to invest. And that's a better, I think, alternative to this than the endogenous one. So what we did was we looked at both the GDP per capita and the growth rates, and those things don't wipe out the story. So basically, that if you're looking at a rapidly growing country, even holding that constant, you still have this aging effect coming in and being important. The third point I would say is that those alternatives don't give you the specifics that we get out of this theory. They don't give you the inverted U, and they don't give you the prediction that the shape of that U becomes flatter as the population ages. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't make up a story that would give you that, but it's just not obvious that that comes out of this. The theory that we suggest does. Okay, that's it. So let me go back to where I started. What we've done here is tried to combine a couple of ideas that Gary had. Obviously, not ideas. He started the literatures on human capital and on economics of fertility. Tried to combine those and talk about how those would be linked in the production of human capital and how that might depend on the structure of a population, the specific predictions we get. Aging societies have less entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship rate is lower in an aging society at every given age. And then finally, because the creativity and human capital effects offset, you get the inverted U shape. That seems to be what we see in the data. So let me stop there and take a couple of questions, and maybe I can even give Jim a couple of extra minutes since he always seems to welcome those. So anyway, thanks very much. Let me stop there, and you're up, Jim.